A janitor's death in 1988 was ruled natural until his grandson found a locked drawer at the church. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, for taking time not just to watch, but to take care of the memory of someone who was never supposed to be remembered. You see, for decades, my grandfather was known simply as the janitor at St. Bartholomew's Church. That's how his obituary listed him. Joseph Langston, longtime custodian, passed away peacefully at 58. No legacy, no questions. Just another quiet death in a quiet town in 1988. Everyone accepted it, except my mother, and eventually me. I didn't come back to this town to stir anything up. I came back because work dried up out west, and a friend on the town council offered me a part-time job refurbishing the back halls of the church. It was supposed to be simple. Sand the floors, fix the paneling, maybe repaint the office where the old boiler controls were kept. That's where it started. The office hadn't been touched in years. The window was stuck half open. The carpet smelled like oil and dust, and the desk, his old desk, was still there, shoved against the far wall, surrounded by half-empty paint cans and rusted brooms. I don't know what made me open the drawer. Maybe it was the way the light hit the brass handle, or maybe something deeper. But when I pulled, it didn't move, locked. And that was strange, because nothing else in the room was locked. Nothing else had ever needed to be. The janitor's drawer was locked. I asked around. One of the older maintenance guys, Pete, I think, just shrugged and said, "That thing's been shut since the 80s. Nobody's bothered, probably empty." But it wasn't. 3 days later, I brought in a slim lockpick kit. Not because I expected to find anything important, but because something about that drawer refused to let me walk away. I sat on the floor. The whole church was quiet, except for the faint creak of the steeple settling in the cold. After about 20 minutes of careful tensioning, the lock clicked. Inside was a towel, folded neatly. Beneath it, a flashlight long dead, a sealed envelope, and a rubber-banded bundle of Polaroids. I stared. The envelope had no name, no markings, just a handwritten note across the flap that read, "If you find this, forgive me." I opened it. The letter was from my grandfather. The handwriting was careful, not rushed. It began with a date, April 3rd, 1988. And then this. If you're reading this, it means no one ever listened. Not then, maybe now. I'm sorry. But I have to write it all somewhere. The next lines described a girl, 17, volunteering for the youth ministry, crying in the west hallway. She told him she had been hurt by someone she thought she could trust. Then he named the man. Father Ellis. I had to stop reading. The name was burned into my childhood. He was the priest who baptized me, who led my mother's wedding ceremony, who gave my grandfather's eulogy. The same man my grandfather said had assaulted a girl behind the church offices, then walked out adjusting his collar. "I reported it," he wrote. "I gave the file to Ellis himself and another to the diocese. They told me to let it go, that it would be handled, but nothing happened. The girl was gone the next day, transferred, they said, and now I can't sleep. I see her face. I see the fear, and I know if I stay quiet, I'm as guilty as they are." My hands were shaking. The photographs were next. 4 Polaroids. The first showed the youth wing hallway, empty. The second, a young girl sitting on the steps, clutching her arms. Third, Ellis, caught mid-turn, as if startled. The fourth, a blur. Nothing clear, just motion and panic. And beneath it all, a carbon copy of an official misconduct complaint, filed under Joseph Langston, dated April 2nd, 1988, with a church stamp that read, "Received. He'd tried. He'd told the truth. He died 3 days later." The official cause was heart failure, but I was starting to feel a different kind of truth pulse through my ribs. The kind that said, this wasn't just about a drawer. It was about what had been locked away long before the wood warped around it, and I had just opened it. I didn't sleep that night. The letter, the photos, the complaint, they sat in a small box on my desk, like a bomb with no ticking, just waiting. Around 3 a.m., I found myself staring out the window, watching the wind toy with the leaves outside the parsonage gate. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Every silence stretched too long. I wasn't afraid, not exactly, but I felt like I had walked into a story that someone had tried very hard to erase. The next morning, I returned to the office, this time with gloves. Something in me knew this wasn't just a family matter anymore. I carefully scanned every piece of paper, every photo, even the envelope. I wanted a digital record in case the originals ever disappeared. The church had a long memory when it came to traditions, but a very short one when it came to accountability. The name Jody March was written on the back of the Polaroid showing the girl. It was faint, but there. My grandfather must have written it. I typed it into every search engine, every newspaper archive I could find. Nothing. No obituaries, no wedding announcements, no missing persons. She was a ghost. But I wasn't giving up. I knew that if Ellis had covered something up, someone else had helped him. Churches don't operate in a vacuum. There's always someone filing paperwork, answering phones, serving coffee at Sunday school. Someone knew what happened. And if they were still alive, I needed to find them. So I did what any grandson of a janitor would do. I started in the basement. The church archives were a mess. Mismatched boxes, dust thick enough to write scripture in. But I remembered Grandpa Joe once told me, truth doesn't hide where it's pretty. It hides where no one bothers to look. So I looked. For hours. Sweating through my shirt, blinking against cobwebs, sorting through yellowing programs and forgotten donation ledgers. And then, buried between a box of 1986 choir rosters and a broken fan, I found it. A binder labeled Youth Ministry Retreats, 1988. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside, sign-in sheets, transportation forms, emergency contact lists. And there, third page in, was her name. Jody March, age 17, assigned to cabin 4B. No parent or guardian listed, just a note in red ink, sponsored by Parish Fund. I flipped to the end of the binder. There were counselor notes. Most were uneventful. Good group this year. Cabin 2 boys need supervision, that sort of thing. Then one note, written in block letters. J. March requested to leave early, escorted off-site by Father E. No date, no signature, just that. That wasn't protocol. I'd helped run church events as a teen. You never let a minor leave early without a guardian, especially not with a priest, and no paper trail. My pulse thundered in my ears. I took photos of everything. I needed help. Someone who understood what to do with this kind of thing. That's when I remembered Mrs. Kerrigan. Elaine Kerrigan had been the church secretary for nearly 30 years before she retired. She was sharp, blunt, and remembered everything. If there was anyone who knew what the church tried to bury, it was her. She lived in a small blue house 2 blocks from the bakery, always smelled faintly of lavender and paper ink. When I knocked, she opened the door with narrowed eyes. "You look just like your grandfather," she said. I nodded. I found his file. She didn't ask which file. She just stepped aside and said, "Come in." We sat in her sunroom, and I laid the Polaroids and binder pages in front of her. She looked at each photo for a long time, then placed it down gently, as if touching a wound that never healed. "He told me," she said quietly, "Joe, about the girl. I begged him not to report it through Father Ellis. I told him to go straight to the police, but he said he had to try the chain of command first. Said the church deserved the chance to do the right thing." I swallowed hard. "And when they didn't?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "He mailed a second copy of the complaint to the diocese. I saw him drop it in the mailbox myself. The next morning, he didn't show up for work. They said heart failure. But Joe didn't have heart problems. He had perfect blood pressure, took his walks every evening, ate oatmeal every morning. No, they didn't kill him, but they killed his spirit the night before. That's what broke him." I sat there, stunned. "Why didn't you come forward?" I asked. "I was scared," she said, "and ashamed. I convinced him to try the right way. I thought it would work. When it didn't, I stayed quiet, because I thought I had helped kill him." She reached out and put her hand on mine. "But you found more than he ever could. Don't let it die again." I promised her I wouldn't. That night, I opened a new folder on my desktop, Langston Archive. I scanned every page, every note, and started compiling a timeline. April 1st, Jody attends retreat. April 2nd, incident. April 3rd, report filed. April 4th, Joe dies. A perfect, tragic arc. And then, one last thing. As I was reviewing the complaint again, I noticed something strange. A faded red stamp beneath the received mark. I enhanced it digitally. Reviewed, no further action. GE. Those initials again. Not Ellis. Someone else. Someone even higher up. And suddenly, I realized this wasn't just about one priest. This was a system, and I was about to step right into its darkest corner. The initials haunted me. GE. They appeared like a watermark behind every decision, every closed file, every silence. At first, I thought it might be some coded reference, a filing system, or administrative shorthand. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. These weren't just letters. They were a signature, a name, abbreviated and repeated, stamped beneath a decade of buried voices. I didn't sleep. Again. My mind spun through every possible name from my childhood, every bulletin, every article. And then it hit me. During one of those restless, blurry-eyed moments just before dawn. George Ellsworth, the diocesan administrator in 1988. Not a priest, not someone who wore the collar, but someone who moved the chess pieces behind the scenes. He wasn't often at the pulpit, but he was always at the meetings. My mother had mentioned him once after a finance committee gathering. That man has the coldest eyes I've ever seen, she had said, like he's counting something invisible. He was the one who had final review on internal church complaints at the time, and he was still alive, now retired and living just 2 counties over in a gated community designed for former clergy and staff. I found his address listed in an old Christmas card directory buried in the church records. Handwritten, neatly updated, with a new zip code and phone number. I didn't call. I just drove. The neighborhood was too clean, lawns too short, houses identical, like clones lined up to pretend nothing had ever gone wrong. When I pulled up, I saw wind chimes hanging from the porch, brass, polished. I knocked once, then again. The door opened just a sliver. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, deliberate. "Mr. Ellsworth?" I asked. "Yes," he said, guarded. "Who are you?" "My name is Benjamin Langston. I'm Joe Langston's grandson." I watched his face stiffen. "I'm not here to fight," I said quickly. "I just want the truth." He opened the door wider, not in welcome. More like a man willing to tolerate 5 minutes of conversation before calling security. "I know who your grandfather was," he said. "He filed a complaint. You reviewed it, stamped it, then nothing happened." George stepped back, motioning to a stiff wooden chair in his entry hall. "You have 5 minutes." I sat. He stayed standing, arms crossed. "Do you know how many reports came across my desk?" "In 1988, he said. "I know the ones that mattered," I replied. He nodded slowly, like he respected the reply, even if it cut him. "Do you think it was that simple?" he asked. "A janitor files a complaint, and the entire machinery of the church grinds to a halt to investigate? You think we weren't under pressure from every direction? Lawsuits, political scrutiny, media sharks? We triaged. We assessed risk. We did what the institution demanded." "And a girl disappeared," I said. "She was not our responsibility," he said coldly. "She was a foster child. No legal guardian on file. No follow-up contact. Do you know how often the system loses track of those girls?" "I don't care how often," I said. "I care about this one." Ellsworth's mouth twitched. Not guilt, annoyance. "Your grandfather wasn't stupid," he said. "He knew how things worked. He pushed anyway. And when the machine didn't move, he blamed himself. That's not on me." He turned his back to me and walked toward a side hallway, then came back with a folder. He tossed it on the table. "Here," he said. "The original complaint file. His letter, my notes, I kept it. Not because I cared, but because I knew someday someone like you would come asking. You want to know what's inside the machine? This is it. Rot. Dust. Nothing heroic." I stared at the folder. "You kept this for 35 years. He didn't answer, just opened the door again. I took the file and walked out without another word. In the car, I opened it. My grandfather's complaint was there, but something else too. A photograph I hadn't seen. It was the retreat group photo. All the teens and chaperones lined up in front of the church sign. And there, second row, hands folded tightly in front of her, Jody March. But it wasn't her expression that chilled me. It was Ellis, standing behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his face smiling for the camera, but his eyes staring at something, someone, just outside the frame. When I got home, I digitized everything, labeled and stored each piece in encrypted folders back them up to multiple drives. I wasn't just cataloging evidence anymore. I was building a case. But I needed more than paper. I needed people. I called Mrs. Kerrigan again, asked her if she remembered who else had worked that retreat. She paused. There was a youth coordinator, she said. A girl, Mary Ann something, just out of college. Sweet, kind. She only lasted a year. I started digging. It took hours, but eventually I found her. Mary Ann Gates, now retired, living in Oregon. Listed as a trauma counselor for survivors of institutional abuse. I stared at the screen. That couldn't be a coincidence. I called. "Hello?" she answered. Her voice was soft, steady. "Ms. Gates, my name is Benjamin Langston. I think you were at a retreat in 1988. St. Bartholomew's?" A pause. Then, I knew this day would come. Her voice was calm, but not surprised, as if she had been waiting for this call for years, maybe dreading it, maybe welcoming it. I could hear something in the silence between her words, regret maybe, or just fatigue from carrying too much truth too long. When I told her my name, she didn't ask why I was calling. She simply said, "If you're serious about knowing what happened, come in person." The next morning, I was on the road. It took 10 hours to reach her town, small, tucked between the Oregon forest and the coast. Everything smelled of pine and salt. Her house sat at the edge of a ridge, the kind of place where wind always finds its way through the trees. When she opened the door, she looked exactly like someone who had survived something without anyone asking how. Her hair was tied back in a braid, streaked with gray. Her eyes were sharp, steady. She didn't invite me in with small talk, just a nod toward the living room and a cup of tea already waiting. "I remember your grandfather," she said, sitting down. "He was kind, unafraid in a way that made people nervous." I nodded. "He tried to report something about a girl, Jody March." Mary Ann flinched, almost imperceptibly. "She was 17, she said. Came to the retreat through the youth outreach program." I remember thinking she was too quiet, too still, like someone who had learned to hide without moving. She looked down at her cup. I didn't see it. Not at first, but there were signs. She never took communion. She asked to sleep near the emergency exit in the bunk room. And she always avoided Father Ellis. Always. I pulled out the group photo. "She's in this one." Mary Ann took it, her fingers trembling slightly. "He put his hand on her shoulder," she whispered. "He insisted she stand near him. She didn't say no, but she didn't breathe either." I told her about the drawer, the file, the complaint. The initials GE stamped across the fate of a missing girl. I told her about Ellsworth, about the silence, about how everything had gone dark, the moment my grandfather tried to shine a light. And then she stood, walked down the hallway, came back with a folder of her own. Inside, a retreat roster, counselor notes, a single-page incident log marked "Sensitive Internal Review Only." She placed it in front of me. "Read it." The log described a nonspecific behavioral concern involving Jody, late-night anxiety, refusing to speak during group prayer. It ended with the line, "Escorted off-site by Reverend Ellis for early departure at youth's request." "That was a lie," she said. "I never saw her leave. None of the other counselors did. Ellis said she needed solitude, that she was spiritually overwhelmed, that she would be safer away from the group." She paused. "No one ever saw her again." My throat tightened. Did you tell anyone? I submitted this report, she said, tapping the folder. Ellis told me it had been handled, that the diocese was aware. A week later, I was reassigned, out of state, told it was a promotion. But I knew it was exile. She looked at me, and I let them. We sat in silence. There was nothing to say. Then she reached back into the folder and handed me a final sheet. A letter she'd written a year later, addressed to the diocesan board. It began with a sentence I would never forget. I am writing not as a counselor, but as a witness afraid of her own silence. It was never sent. Why didn't you mail it? I asked. I thought I was alone, she said, and silence felt safer than starting a war I couldn't win. I folded the letter and placed it with my growing file. You're not alone now. She nodded, eyes shining. Before I left, she said something that stuck with me more than anything else that day. I used to think churches were built to keep the world out, she said, but maybe they were built to keep the truth in. On the drive back, I kept replaying her words. I thought about my grandfather's hands, calloused, steady, always fixing broken hinges and jammed windows. I thought about Jody, 17 and invisible. I thought about how many people like Marianne had tried to scream inside their own heads for decades, while the world outside sang hymns and passed around offering plates. When I returned to town, I drove straight to the church. It was dusk. The sanctuary was empty. I walked past the pews, past the altar, down the hallway where the youth offices had once been. I reached the locked archive room. This time I had the key. Father Adams had given it to me after our last conversation. Said he trusted me to look for the truth. Inside the archive room, everything was as it had always been. Cold, dusty, forgotten. I opened the drawer labeled 1988, flipped through file after file, and then I found it. Langston Joseph, complaint, filed, stamped, unread. But this one was different. It had a second stamp. Reviewed, closed, no further action. And one more thing, a handwritten note at the bottom. Destroy after review, G.E. But it hadn't been destroyed. My grandfather had made a copy, and now so had I. I sat with the file open on my lap, barely breathing. The note at the bottom, destroy after review, G.E., burned into the page like a brand. It wasn't just a denial, it was an instruction to erase, in order to vanish someone's pain. But it had survived, because my grandfather had disobeyed. He didn't destroy it. He made a copy. And for 35 years, it sat locked away, waiting. I stared at that signature again. G.E. George Ellsworth. And I realized he hadn't just closed my grandfather's file. He had signed dozens, maybe hundreds, with that same cold efficiency. He hadn't just been a bureaucrat. He'd been a gatekeeper. The man who made sure the stories never left the building. And yet, this one had. I spent the next 2 days in the town library, combing through archived newsletters, scanned newspaper clippings, anything that might connect the dots. I found 2 more complaints from 1987 and 1989. One was dismissed as unfounded, the other insufficient evidence. Both stamped with the same red ink, both signed by G.E. Then something caught my eye. A newsletter from early 19I celebrating the opening of a new diocesan retreat center. George Ellsworth was listed as Director of Clerical Oversight, a new title, a quiet promotion. No mention of Father Ellis. Just a smiling photograph of Ellsworth cutting the ribbon beside two bishops. The machine had rewarded him. I leaned back in the hard wooden chair, every muscle in my back burning from hours hunched over the microfiche scanner. My grandfather had died for telling the truth, and Ellsworth had climbed higher for burying it. But things were different now. I had names, I had documents, I had Marianne Gates's testimony and the retreat logs, and somewhere out there was Jody March, older now, maybe still afraid, maybe unreachable, but maybe not. That night, I called Andrea Price. She answered on the second ring. "You're the guy with the janitor story," she said. "Yes," I said, "and I think it's a lot more than that." I met her the next morning in a small cafe across from the courthouse. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s, confident, sharp-eyed, the kind of reporter who didn't waste time pretending to be polite. I handed her the folder. She read in silence for 10 minutes, then looked up. "This is solid," she said, "but if we're going to run this, we need someone else, another source. Someone who can confirm the girl's identity or connect Ellis to more than just this one file." "I'm looking for her," I said. "Jody March." Andrea nodded slowly. "If you find her, this goes national." We started digging together. She had access to sealed court records, genealogy databases, missing persons registries. A week passed, then two. Finally, she found something. A civil suit filed in Oregon in 1996. Jane Doe versus Diocese of New Hope. Settled out of court, sealed. But the case summary listed the plaintiff's initials, J.M., and the attached documents were signed by one attorney, Marianne Gates. We had her. Andrea reached out through the lawyer, and 2 days later, Jody March called me. Her voice was cautious at first, but not afraid. Older, yes. Wiser, but not broken. "I wondered if someone would ever ask," she said. I didn't know what to say. "I remember your grandfather," she continued. "He found me crying behind the chapel. He sat down, didn't touch me, didn't ask me to explain, just said, 'You're not crazy, and you're not invisible.' I'd never heard anyone say that before." I was silent for a moment. "He filed a complaint. He tried." "I know," she said, "and I never got to thank him." She paused. "Do what you need to do. You have my permission to use my name. Just tell it right." Andrea ran the story a week later. Front page, Sunday edition. The janitor's file. How a church custodian tried to stop a predator and was buried with the truth. The backlash was immediate. Letters to the editor, church spokespeople denying knowledge, anonymous threats, but also dozens of emails from other survivors. One from a retired priest who said, "I saw what Ellis did. I was too much of a coward to speak." The diocese issued a public statement promising an internal review. They removed Ellis's name from the church's youth center wall. A memorial plaque was commissioned for Joseph Langston, but none of it felt like justice. Not yet. Because the file I found wasn't the only one, and Ellsworth wasn't the only name at the bottom of these silences. There was a system, an entire structure that had turned a man like my grandfather into a whisper while lifting predators into pulpits. I stood in the church basement again, weeks later, holding a box filled with copied files, and I made a decision to build something permanent. I launched a public archive, the Langston Ledger. Survivors could upload files anonymously. Former employees could share stories, documents, scanned letters. Every page was time-stamped. Every file was saved in triplicate. No stamp from Ellsworth or anyone else would ever erase them again. And then something I never expected happened. An envelope arrived at my house. No return address. Inside, a photograph, black and white, faded. It was of my grandfather, standing next to a younger man in a priest's robe. Behind them, the old wooden church doors, both of them smiling. On the back, in pen, "Some things are worth cleaning more than once." No signature, just the quiet echo of a man who spent his life sweeping away things the world tried to ignore. And now, finally, the world was starting to see what he left behind. It's been 6 months since the first article published. 6 months since I watched my grandfather's name trend on Twitter for something other than obituary records. 6 months since the letters started arriving. Some typed, some handwritten, all carrying a weight I could feel in my bones. Most began the same way. I never knew Joseph Langston, but after reading what he did, I wish I had. People sent candles, pages from their own church bulletins, scanned photocopies of lost files, receipts, faded letters, confidential memos that no longer felt right staying hidden. The Langston Ledger became more than an archive. It became a reckoning. One survivor wrote, "I always thought silence was safety, but reading about Joe, I realized silence was the system." Another, "I was 12. He was my confessor. I never spoke his name until I read your story. Now, I can't stop saying it. Father Ellis, Father Ellis, Father Ellis." He was not a man of God. He was a man of habit and cover. And then there was Jody. She came to town. I met her at the edge of the river behind St. Bartholomew's, the same place where the youth group used to hold baptisms. She walked with quiet purpose, her steps light but sure. Her hair now cut short, gray at the temples. Her face carried age, yes, but also peace. "I almost didn't come," she said. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't," I replied. She looked at the water for a long time. I wanted to see where it ended, or maybe where it started. We sat on a bench that hadn't been replaced in decades. The wood creaked under us. I handed her something wrapped in cloth. The keys. My grandfather's old key ring. She held them in her hand, just listening to the way they clinked. She didn't cry. She just nodded, like she understood something no one else could. "That sound," she said, "used to tell me I had 10 seconds to breathe." Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside, a copy of a journal entry she'd written in 1988. It was never meant to be read by anyone else, until now. "I saw him," it began. "He found me, and I didn't have to explain. That was the first time I felt real in years." She gave me the copy for the archive, said it belonged with his file. "It's not just his story anymore," she said. "It's mine too." That night, The church held a memorial, not a funeral, not a ceremony, just memory. They opened the doors at dusk. Candles were passed hand to hand. Andrea read excerpts from the article. Father Adams, now fully transparent, offered no sermon, just silence. And then they unveiled it, a bronze plaque, mounted near the boiler room hallway where Joe spent most of his working life. It read, "In memory of Joseph Langston, custodian, witness, keeper of light." He saw what others looked away from, and he stayed. There was no applause, just breath, deep, collective breath, like something sacred had been exhaled after years of being held too tightly. I stayed long after everyone left, sat by the plaque, ran my fingers along the edges. It was cold to the touch, but solid, real. For the first time, my grandfather's name wasn't hidden in the footnotes. It was carved where people could see it, and more importantly, where people could ask why. Later, in the stillness of the sanctuary, I walked the aisles one more time. The pews were empty, the altar lights dimmed. I stood beneath the stained glass and closed my eyes. And I heard them. Keys. Just a soft jingle. Not loud, not startling, but clear. Somewhere in the hall. I didn't open my eyes. I just said, "Thank you." And then I walked out into the night. The ledger still lives. Every week, more stories arrive. Some handwritten, others anonymous. Some contain names. Some just initials. But each one adds to something larger than silence. Because the truth isn't just about what's uncovered. It's about what we choose to keep uncovered. My grandfather wasn't a hero in his lifetime, but now he's a reason others finally believe they can speak. And I intend to keep that keyring turning, one drawer at a time.